Good morning, and welcome to the first of two videos on human evolution. Now, before we get into the idea of human evolution, let me just say this. All right, there are some folks out there who are anti-evolution, if you will, and they base this on religious grounds and other grounds. But one of the things that you should know, one of the questions that's always asked of me is, how can you teach evolution in a Catholic school? Well, in reality, the Catholic Church is a very staunch supporter of the theory of evolution. Uh, Saint Pope John Paul II published an encyclical essentially stating that as long as you believe that God put this process in motion, that there is no conflict between the theory of evolution and the idea of a God as the creator of the universe. Now, I don't want to get into the theological stuff. I don't want to get into the political stuff. I'm just going to tell you what the scientific evidence is for evolution. And in the second video, we'll talk specifically about human evolution. Now, before we actually talk about evolution on the level of an organism or a species, let's take a step back, because modern science has come to the conclusion, and rightfully so, that evolution actually takes place at the molecular level. It is changes in DNA, nucleotides, nucleotide sequence, perhaps chromosomes or even copies of genes that actually leads to changes in organisms. Right? Those changes can be either beneficial or harmful. If they're harmful, of course, that mutation will die out in the population. However, if they are helpful for some reason, then in theory, as long as they are genetically controlled and heritable, in other words, you can pass them on into your offspring, then in that case, you end up with a trait, an adaptation that will be passed on and spread throughout future generations. And that's how evolution as a whole works. Now, there's a good deal of evidence for biological evolution, and that's what this first video will really concentrate on. Okay, so let's define what biological evolution actually is before we move any further into this. Biological evolution is defined as a change in population or a species over time. Notice that evolution is not the change in an individual over time. I cannot biologically evolve. All right. When I was a kid, I wanted to play in the NBA. Well, I'm 5'8" and not that coordinated. So, you know, I could probably work on the coordination part, but to gain another 4 inches in height or more in order to be tall enough to play in the NBA is probably not going to happen at my age. All right, so individuals don't evolve biologically. It's populations and species that change over time. Two important things that you should keep in mind. All living things have descended from a common ancestor and therefore have a common chemistry. We've already noted when we talked about DNA that all living organisms on Earth share the same genetic background. We all use the same four nucleotides, five in the case of RNA, but in our DNA, we all use those same nucleotides. Now, they're organized in different fashions. They're rearranged in different ways to form different genes or different forms of certain genes, but we all share that DNA chemistry, all right? From the simplest bacteria all the way up through mammals and specifically humans. The second thing is that living things adapt to their environment, all right? We have our populations, our species have changed over time to adapt to changes in the world around us. Climate change is not a new thing. All right, climate change has been occurring on Earth for millions and millions of years. Now, I don't want to get into the politics of are humans causing it? That's not the point here. But the climate on Earth has changed. We've had ice ages. We've had long periods of very dry times. In certain areas of the world, and those climate changes oftentimes will uh, lead to changes in a population because some individuals are better suited to adapt to those changes. And again, the key word here is adaptation. And adaptation is a characteristic that allows an organism to survive and to reproduce in its environment. The two key terms here are survive and reproduce. All right. Just living to a ripe old age is not enough. All right. You have to be able to pass your characteristics, those adaptations, on into the next generation and future generations. That brings us to a discussion of fossils. All right. The earliest evidence for biological evolution was the discovery of fossils of organisms, specifically of organisms that are no longer living on Earth. Think dinosaurs. All right. When the first dinosaur fossils were discovered, people looked at them and said, "What the heck is this?" All right. Well, what are fossils? Well, fossils are simply traces of past life. All right. They allow us also to trace the descent of a particular group of organisms. Darwin, who is obviously the father of our modern theory of evolution, was an English naturalist. And he relied on fossils to formulate his theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, transitional fossils have characteristics of two different groups. And so if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see that there are a variety of fossils drawn into this illustration. But what you find is that the fossils change as you move from layer to layer to layer. Now, the oldest fossils would be found down here in the lowest layer, and the most recent fossils would be found up here in the uppermost levels here. And if you follow the patterns, the transitions from one to the next, you can see changes in organisms over time. All right, the organisms that lived 5 million years ago are not the same as the ones that live today. And you can oftentimes find uh, fossils in lower levels that are transitional, that show characteristics of the not only the groups below them, but also of the groups above them. All right, even though the group above and below are not the same as the one in the middle. All right, and so the fossil record really does give us an excellent example of biological evolution. We can follow and trace the line of descent of certain species. What have we learned from the fossil record? All right. Well, generally speaking, the fossil record tells us that wow. I guess I need another cup of coffee. The fossil record tells us that life progressed from simple to more complex. All right. The first fossils that are found in the fossil record are prokaryotes, bacteria, and archaea. All right. Very simple organisms, single-celled, tiny little organisms. They are followed by the unicellular eukaryotes, all right, the algae and the protists and that sort of thing. And then eventually by the multicellular eukaryotes, the fungi and the plants and the animals. We know that fish evolved before terrestrial plants. Right, that's an interesting aspect. And fish evolved before terrestrial mammals. All right, so those first animals were fish. All right. We know that non-flowering plants preceded flowering plants, meaning that flowers are a recent addition to the life on Earth. We know that amphibians came before reptiles. And one of the most fascinating discoveries in the last 30 years or so is that we've realized now that birds, all right, the birds that are flying out your window, flying outside your in the yard and whatnot, those birds are actually reptiles. Okay. Um, and so back in when I was in high school and even in college, we said that there were five classes of vertebrates. All right, the amphibians, the reptiles, the birds, and the mammals. That's only four. Oh, and the fish. Um, but today there are only four because we now consider the birds to actually be part of the class Reptilia. And the picture on the right-hand side is a dinosaur fossil, dinosaur called Archaeopteryx. Um, and this thing was a feathered lizard, essentially. Okay, second thing, all right, biogeographical evidence, all right? This is the study of how plants and animals around the world are similar and different at the same time. Um, it supports the hypothesis that organisms tend to originate in one location and then spread out, either in a certain geographical area or maybe even around the world. Um, Whenever geography separates areas of land, right, whether it's because it's an island or because areas are separated by a mountain range or a huge valley, that sort of thing, you expect to find different life forms on either side of that barrier, whatever the barrier happens to be. Great examples of this exist on islands, all right, because islands, especially islands way out in the middle of the ocean, tend to have very unique life forms because of their isolation geographically from other areas of the world. Think about the life forms that we find on Australia. All right, Australia is the only major continent that has the vast majority of its mammals being marsupials, all right, the pouched mammals, all right, kangaroos and koalas and others. These animals are actually born uh, very, very underdeveloped, and they make their way into their mother's pouch, where they then feed for a period of time until they are able to get out on their own. All right, but mom carries them around in a pouch. These are not very common life forms in other areas of the world. As a matter of fact, the only marsupial currently living in North America is the opossum. There's also anatomical evidence. All right. The Think about this. All right. The number of bones in your hands are the same as the number of bones in a bat's wing, in a bird's wing, in a horse's front hoof, um, in a whale's flipper. All right. They're all the same. All right. You can find evidence of the same bones. Now, some of them have fused, some of them have gotten longer, bigger, whatever, because of adaptations to that particular organism's environment. But there are the same number of bones. We can see this. These are called homologous structures. Right? These are structures that are anatomically similar. And the reason for this is that the two organisms that you're comparing descended from a common ancestor. All right, think about those vertebrate forelimbs that we were talking about, the horse's hoof, the bat's wing, the human hand. There are also what we call analogous structures, and these are not to be confused with homologous structures. Analogous structures are things that serve the same function but do not share a common ancestry because they're not made the same way. They're not formed the same way. Think about the wings of an insect and the wings of a bird. All right, the wings of a bird have their bones on the inside with scaly feathers on the outside. The wings of an insect are made of a completely different material, and there's no bones inside of them. They both help the organisms to fly, but they are not the same. All right, they didn't evolve from a common ancestor. There's also the question of vestigial structures, and these are anatomical features fully developed in one group but reduced in another group. All right. For example, whales, some species of whales, not all, have a pelvic girdle, and legs, leg bones. All right. But the bones are actually buried inside their flesh. There's no leg there sticking out of the
It's
whale's
nine
body.
o'clock.
Well, thank you, Jesus. All right, there are no legs sticking out of the whale's body. Some species of snakes also have leg bones, and again, they don't stick out through the body wall. All right, but the bones are there. All right, these are vestigial structures. An example of a vestigial structure in humans is our appendix. In strictly herbivorous animals, animals that eat only vegetable matter, that organ is very developed. It's very, very long. As a matter of fact, it's almost as long as the small intestine itself. But in us, the appendix has shrunk because our diets are now omnivorous. We eat plants and meat, all right, which is a reasonably new adaptation. Um, this is actually an illustration of what we were talking about earlier in terms of homologous structures. Notice we have the wing of a bird, the wing of a bat, the flipper of a whale, the forelimb of a cat, the forelimb of a horse, and the forelimb of a human. All right, our arms. Now, notice all of the bones are there in each of these organisms. All right. Now, they may be different sizes and shapes relative to the body size of the animal, but they're all there. They may be fused. Like, for example, in the wing of a bird, most of the digits have been fused. The phalanges in the bones have been fused. The same thing is true in a horse. The one that may surprise you is the flipper of a whale. All right, there are actually finger bones in whale flippers. All right, and so there that is an evidence that evolution has occurred. As a matter of fact, it's believed that whales evolved from a horse-like ancestor. So whales and horses actually share a recent, well, relatively recent common ancestor. Okay. Now, as we said right in the beginning of this lesson, there's also the idea of biochemical evidence. Almost every organism on Earth shares the same biochemicals. All right. For example, DNA. All right. The four nucleotides that make up the DNA of humans are shared by all of the other organisms on Earth: bacteria, archaea, protists, fungi, plants, and the rest of the animals. They also all use ATP, adenosine triphosphate, the energy molecule that we use in respiration, and for fuel for some of our metabolic reactions. All living things use the same triplet code. Remember the codons we talked about a few chapters ago? All right, the adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uh, uh, thymine, which are held together in triplet codons. All right, guess what? All organisms use those same triplet codes. Um, Living things use the same 20 amino acids in their proteins. All right, there are some additional ones, but the 20 are still there. And here's the most fascinating thing: living things share many of the same genes. Our genome, remember, we said the other day that human beings, all humans, share about 99.9% of their DNA. All right, so 99.9% of my DNA is found in you. All right, it but that's not only just amongst humans. All right, we share somewhere around 95-96% of our DNA with chimpanzees. All right, almost exactly the same, 95% of it. All right, and the same can be said. We can work our way down the evolutionary tree back toward the trunk and find that we share genes with all sorts of organisms. All right, very simple ones, and for obviously the more complex ones. So, how does evolution actually work? All right, well, Darwin uh, subscribed to a theory of evolution by natural selection, and this is his book describes a mechanism by which a species becomes adapted to its environment. Notice, again, it says species, not individual. All right, we're talking species here. All right, individuals do not evolve. There are three aspects to Darwin's theory. First is variation. There's got to be variation within a population. All right, and that variation must be able to be passed from generation to generation. And so it must be what we say, or what we call, heritable. All right, in other words, you can pass the gene for a certain trait into the next generation. All right, not every variation is heritable. All right, if I cut off my arm and then go make another kid, that kid is still going to be born with an arm, even though I don't have one. All right, that's a rather graphic example, but scientists 100 years ago would cut the tails off the mice with a population of mice, let them breed, and generation after generation after generation, they all produced babies with tails. All right, so just cutting off the tails of a mouse does not cause evolution. Next, there has to be competition. All right, specifically for limited resources, things like food, mates, shelter. All right, and those who are better adapted will be able to survive and reproduce and pass those genes on into the next generation. All right, and finally, subsequent generations will see an increase in the number of individuals who actually have those adaptations, as long as the conditions are in which that species lives remain the same. So you can ignore Lamarck's proposal. I don't really want to talk about this today, but Lamarck had his own theory of evolution, which preceded Darwin's by a couple of decades. But Darwin essentially, and we use giraffes as an example, originally giraffe neck length varied, just like the neck length of people varies, and all sorts of other things vary in human populations. Competition for resources allowed long-necked giraffes to survive and to reproduce. All right, and therefore they produced more offspring than short-necked giraffes. All right, so if assuming long necks was a heritable trait, something that could be passed on into future generations, then the necks in subsequent generations would get longer and longer and longer. And so nowadays, due to natural selection, most giraffes have long necks. Now, it turns out that recently studies have been shown that the long necks in giraffes are actually a trait that is adapted for sexual selection. All right, long necks apparently are attractive to female giraffes. So the longer the neck of a male giraffe, the better he'll do in terms of finding mates. They actually use their necks in combat. They bump into each other, fight each other, wrap them around each other, and that sort of thing. But in any event, the giraffe thing is a good example of how natural selection might work. Okay, so this is a video which outlines evidence of evolution, which kind of sums up what we've been talking about. So this is the end of the first of two videos on evolution, and when you're done with this, please open up the PowerPoint and click on the hyperlink here and watch this video as well. Stay tuned for the second video, and I hope you learned something.